My name is Hope Miller. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like steady, responsible, and low maintenance. The kind of woman who pays her bills on time, who remembers birthdays, who stays late to clean up after everyone else has left. If you met me before everything happened, you probably would have thought I was quiet in the way people assume quiet means harmless. I worked as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized financial firm in Ohio. Numbers, documentation, patterns. I've always trusted what can be proven more than what can be performed. I don't raise my voice, I don't dramatize pain, I observe. And I was underestimated because of that. People mistake composure for passivity. They mistake restraint for weakness. They mistake silence for surrender. This is not a revenge story. It's not about dramatic courtroom scenes or fiery confrontations. There are no screaming matches, no cinematic takedowns. What happened to me was quieter, and in some ways more chilling. My father staged a fake house fire to erase my existence for insurance money to pay his gambling debts. I survived the flames, and the next morning, while smoke was still in my lungs and ash still clung to my hair, I found my own funeral photo already placed on the altar in our living room, framed, garlanded, as if I had been gone for years. That image did something to me. Not rage, not hysteria. Clarity. The story you're about to hear isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when the person who is supposed to protect you decides you are more valuable as a payout than as a daughter. It's about what it feels like to realize you were never seen as a person, only as a liability, a calculation, a line item. But more than that, it's about what happens next. Because when someone tries to erase you, you're forced to decide who you actually are. I won't dramatize this. I won't exaggerate details to make it more shocking than it already is. I'll tell you what I saw, what I understood, and how I chose to respond. Not with fury, not with public humiliation, but with something far more permanent. If you've ever been quietly underestimated, if you've ever realized too late that someone was rewriting your story without your consent, then maybe you'll understand why I didn't scream. I started documenting. Before we go any further, let me tell you who I was to them. Before the fire, before the altar, before my own photograph was dressed in white flowers, I was the dependable one. In my father's vocabulary, that meant useful. My mother passed away when I was 19. After that, the house in Columbus felt less like a home and more like an unfinished project. My father, Richard Miller, had always been charismatic in public, the kind of man who could shake hands too firmly and laugh too loudly. People liked him. He knew how to perform likability. At home, he preferred silence. Not peaceful silence, evaluative silence. The kind that measures whether you are doing enough to justify your presence. I learned early that usefulness equaled safety. I handled paperwork, insurance renewals, mortgage statements. I organized utility bills into color-coded folders because he said numbers gave him a headache. I made sure the house never fell behind on payments, even when he assured me everything was under control. I thought I was helping. Looking back, I realized I was stabilizing something I didn't fully understand. To him, I wasn't a daughter in the sentimental sense. I was a reliable infrastructure. If something needed signing, I read it. If something needed explaining, I explained it. If something needed absorbing, I absorbed it. Relatives described me as such a good girl. Quiet, mature for my age, old soul. What they really meant was, she doesn't cause trouble. At family gatherings, my father would clap my shoulder and say, "Hope's the smart one, keeps this house running." He said it like praise, and I accepted it like love. But there's a subtle difference between appreciation and delegation. I was never asked what I wanted. I was told what needed to be done. And because I did it without complaint, the expectation calcified. If the car insurance lapsed, I fixed it. If a credit card notice arrived, I reviewed it. If a letter from an unfamiliar lender appeared, I quietly researched it. The first time I noticed inconsistencies in his finances, I told myself not to overthink it. Small withdrawals, cash advances, unusual loan providers, own. He waved it off. Short-term stuff, don't worry about it. And I didn't. Not because I believed him, but because my role wasn't to question. It was to maintain equilibrium. In our home, I occupied a strange position. Visible when something broke, invisible when things appeared stable. No one asked how I felt. Not maliciously, simply because I had trained everyone not to. When you solve every problem quietly, people forget you are human. They start to see you as a function, and functions don't have futures, they have purposes. If you had asked my father who I was back then, he would have said, "My daughter. She's a lifesaver." What he meant was, she keeps things from collapsing. What I didn't understand yet was this. When someone depends on you to hold everything together, they can also begin to resent you for seeing the cracks. And resentment, when mixed with desperation, becomes dangerous. I didn't know it yet, but in his calculations, I had already shifted from daughter to liability. The first time something felt wrong, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no sudden revelation that rewrote my understanding of everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The air outside had that brittle Midwest sharpness. Cold enough to sting, not cold enough to warn you. I had come home early from work because our office network was down. The mail was stacked on the entry table. I wasn't snooping. I was sorting the way I always did. Utility bills on the left, bank envelopes on the right, anything unfamiliar in the center. That's when I saw it. A notice from our homeowner's insurance provider. The policy amount had been increased, substantially. I remember pausing, my thumb still hooked under the envelope flap. My father had never increased coverage before. If anything, he complained every year about premiums going up by $20. This increase wasn't $20. It was a policy revision that nearly doubled the payout value in the event of total structural loss. I sat down at the dining table and read every line twice, then 3 times. When he came home, I asked him about it, calmly, the way I always did. "Oh, that?" He tossed his keys into the bowl without looking at me. "Agent recommended it. Market value's up. Smart move." He didn't meet my eyes. It was subtle. If you weren't trained to notice behavioral shifts, and working in compliance had trained me, you might have missed it. His answers were slightly too fast, slightly rehearsed. I let it go. But that night, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote the date, the policy number, the amount. Not because I suspected something terrible, but because something inside me tightened. A few days later, I overheard him on the phone in the garage. His voice had that brittle tension I had only heard when debt collectors used to call years ago. "I just need time," he said. "You'll get it, I told you." Silence. Then a sharp defensive laugh. "Don't threaten me." When he came inside, he smiled too widely. Asked what I wanted for dinner. I told myself I was over-analyzing, that adults had private stressors, that I wasn't entitled to full transparency. But the insurance increase and the garage phone call began to sit beside each other in my mind. Like 2 puzzle pieces that didn't quite connect yet. The real cut, though, came a week later. I found my birth certificate on the kitchen counter. That might sound insignificant, but important documents in our house were kept in a fireproof safe, a safe I had insisted we purchase. My birth certificate had been removed, photocopied. When I asked him why, he shrugged. "Updating some paperwork." "What paperwork?" He waved his hand. "You worry too much." It was said lightly, almost teasing, but that sentence landed heavier than the insurance notice. "You worry too much." Translated, it meant stop looking. That was the first small cut. Not the policy increase, not the suspicious call, the dismissal, the gentle push back into invisibility. Everyone else would have let it go. Most daughters would have trusted. Most people would have chosen comfort over curiosity. I didn't confront him again. I didn't accuse. I didn't escalate. I documented date, time, what I saw, what he said. Still, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Financial stress didn't automatically equal something criminal. People made adjustments all the time, but something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't being kept out of something for my protection. I was being kept out because I was part of the equation, and I didn't yet know what role I was being assigned in that calculation. After that October, the dismissals didn't stop. They multiplied, quietly, incrementally. The way mold spreads behind drywall is invisible until the structure weakens. If you had asked me, at the time, whether my father was disrespecting me, I would have said no. I would have defended him. I would have explained it away as stress. That's the thing about normalization. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in. The insurance paperwork began arriving more frequently. Amendments, clarifications, endorsements. Each time I asked a question, the response followed the same pattern. "You don't need to worry about that. I've handled it. Trust me." Trust me. It was interesting how often people demand trust when they've stopped offering transparency. Once, I suggested we review the policy together. I even framed it gently. Professional curiosity. It's just what I do for work. I like understanding the fine print. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. You think I can't manage my own house? That's how it was positioned. Not as a shared responsibility, as a challenge to his authority. So I backed down. That became the rhythm. I would notice something. I would ask lightly. He would reinterpret my concern as criticism. I would retreat. Over time, the message embedded itself deeper. Your awareness is inconvenient. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw him sorting through old photo albums. He had pulled out childhood pictures, school portraits, birthday parties, family vacations. He was separating them. Some went back into the album, some went into a cardboard box. What are you doing? I asked. Cluttering. I sat beside him and picked up one of the photos he had set aside. It was my high school graduation, my arm linked with his. He looked proud in that picture, or at least I had always believed he was. Why this one? I asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. No reasons. Just old. Old. I watched him slide 3 more photos into the discard box. All of them featured me. It's strange how your body reacts before your mind does. My chest felt tight. Not angry, just displaced. But I rationalized it. Maybe he was reorganizing. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he didn't realize what he was doing. We are experts at explaining away discomfort when the alternative feels too destabilizing. At work, I audited financial records for inconsistencies. If numbers didn't align, I flagged them immediately. At home, I was watching patterns form and deliberately choosing not to flag them, because acknowledging them would require admitting something deeper. I was no longer being treated as family. I was being managed. The subtle shift continued. He began locking his office door, a room that had always been open. He took calls outside. He grew irritated when I stayed up late in the living room instead of going to bed early. You don't need to hover, he said once. I wasn't hovering, I was reading. But presence had become suspicious. And then came the comment that stayed with me longer than the rest. We were at dinner, nothing dramatic, just takeout containers and the hum of the television in the background. He said it casually. You know, if something ever happened to me, you'd be fine. You're self-sufficient. I nodded. It sounded like reassurance. Then he added, You've always landed on your feet. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. It sounded less like pride and more like calculation. As if he were assessing survivability. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I wrote it down. Date, time, exact wording. That was the stage where disrespect becomes normalized. When you stop reacting outwardly and start recording inwardly. Not because you're plotting, but because somewhere deep down, you understand that one day you may need to prove you were paying attention. And I was, even as I kept pretending I wasn't. There's a moment in every long-standing dynamic when you realize you were never misunderstood. You were categorized. I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly understand my role. It revealed itself slowly, like ink spreading through water. I was the stabilizer, the adult in the room, the quiet insurance policy against chaos. And insurance policies only have value when something goes wrong. One Saturday afternoon in November, I overheard my father speaking to a neighbor in the driveway. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was cleaning the kitchen sink with the window open. She's a good kid, he said about me. Low drama. Doesn't ask for much. The neighbor laughed. You're lucky. My father replied, Yeah, shush. She's easy. Easy! That word settled somewhere under my ribs. I had never thought of myself as difficult, but I had also never considered that my restraint might be interpreted as convenience. Easy daughters don't demand emotional transparency. Easy daughters don't question financial inconsistencies. Easy daughters don't interfere. Easy daughters adapt. That evening, I sat alone in my room and replayed the word in my mind. Easy. And I began to see the structure more clearly. My father didn't see me as fragile. He saw me as durable, which sounds flattering, until you realize durability invites exploitation. If I could handle things, then I would handle things. If I didn't complain, then nothing was wrong. If I kept everything afloat, then the house could absorb more risk. The role had been assigned years ago. After my mother passed, I stepped into logistical adulthood without being asked. I handled hospital paperwork. I helped negotiate funeral arrangements. I reviewed medical bills while my father sat at the kitchen table staring into nothing. Everyone praised me for being so strong. Strength, I learned, is often a trap, because once you demonstrate it, people stop checking whether you're tired. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic intensified. My father grew more erratic in small ways. Mood shifts, sudden generosity followed by quiet withdrawal. He'd bring home groceries without telling me, then criticize the brand of cereal I bought. Inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion keeps you focused on maintaining stability rather than questioning the larger pattern. One night, he handed me a folder and said, "Keep this safe." Inside were copies of the updated insurance documents. "I thought you said I didn't need to worry about it," I said lightly. He smiled. "I trust you." That word again, trust. But this wasn't inclusion. It was a delegation. He wasn't inviting me into understanding. He was positioning me as a record keeper. I flipped through the papers. There were clauses I recognized immediately: accelerated claims processing, streamlined beneficiary verification, emergency payout triggers in cases of total loss with confirmed fatality. Confirmed fatality. The phrase lingered longer than it should have. I looked up at him. Why is the beneficiary structure different? He paused for half a second. Too long. Just simplifying things, he said. I didn't press further, but something crystallized in that moment. I wasn't just the stabilizer anymore. I was part of the paperwork. My name appeared in sections it hadn't before. My identification details were cross-referenced. There were notarized amendments dated weeks earlier, the same week my birth certificate had been copied. And suddenly, the pattern wasn't abstract. It was architectural. I went to my room that night and opened my black notebook. I didn't write emotionally. I wrote methodically. Policy numbers, amendment dates, clauses. Then I wrote one sentence beneath it. If I'm being positioned, for what outcome? That was the first time I allowed myself to consider something darker than financial mismanagement. Not because I wanted to believe it, but because pretending not to see it was no longer protecting anyone. The role had been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible. And if something catastrophic were to happen, the kind of event that triggered accelerated payout, I realized something chilling. Everyone would assume I had simply been unlucky. After all, I was easy. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a discovery. It happened in silence. 3 weeks before the fire, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. to the faint sound of movement downstairs. Not loud enough to alarm, just deliberate enough to register. I lay still in bed, listening. The house had its usual sounds: pipes adjusting, wood contracting in the cold. But this was different. It was methodical. A drawer opening, closing, footsteps, then the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. I got up, not to confront, just to observe. From the top of the staircase, I saw my father in the living room. The lights were off except for a single lamp. He was kneeling near the fireplace, rearranging something inside it. Stacking wood, except it wasn't fireplace season. We hadn't used it in years. The chimney hadn't been cleaned. I didn't speak. I watched the way he moved. Precise, not sleepy, intentional. Then he stood up and stepped into the kitchen. I heard a cabinet open, the one beneath the sink, the one where cleaning supplies were stored. A moment later, there was a sharp, unmistakable scent. Gasoline. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. He carried a small red container back toward the living room. He didn't pour it. Not then. He just placed it near the hearth, as if positioning it. Then he stood still, looking at the room, evaluating it. I don't know how long I stood there watching. 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Time thins in moments like that. Finally, he turned off the lamp and went upstairs. I returned to my room before he could see me. Closed my door softly. Sat on the edge of my bed. That was the shift. Because until that moment, everything could still be interpreted as stress, debt, or secrecy. But gasoline near an unused fireplace at 2:17 a.m. is not stress. It's preparation. And something inside me stopped rationalizing. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I opened my notebook. Wrote the time. Wrote what I saw. The container color. The location. The smell. Then I sat very still. There's a peculiar calm that comes when denial finally collapses. The mind stops negotiating. It begins assessing. If I confronted him, he would deny it. If I accused him, he would reposition it as paranoia. If I left abruptly, I would signal awareness. So I chose something else. I chose patience. The next morning, I acted as usual, made coffee, asked about his sleep. He looked tired but not surprised to see me. That told me something important. He did not expect resistance. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention. The red container disappeared from beneath the sink. The fireplace remained stacked. He began checking smoke detectors, something he had never cared about before. He also insisted I update my personal documents. Just in case, he said. It's good to have everything current. Just in case. But the most revealing moment came 3 days later. He asked casually what time I usually fell asleep. Midnight, I said. He nodded. You're a heavy sleeper, right? The question was light, almost teasing, but I answered honestly. Not your real opposition subay. He studied me for half a second longer than necessary. And in that half second, I saw it. Calculation. That was the day something shifted. Not externally, internally. I stopped being a daughter seeking reassurance. I became a witness gathering clarity. The house felt different after that. Not hostile, just stayed. I began sleeping with my phone charged beside me. I started backing up my notebook entries digitally and emailing copies to a private account he didn't know existed. I checked the insurance clauses again. Accelerated payout upon confirmed fatality. No extended investigation if the fire is ruled accidental. I understood then that desperation makes people believe they can control variables. Timing, narrative, sympathy. What he hadn't accounted for was this. I was not unaware, and I was no longer pretending to be. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was a decision. If something was coming, I would survive it, and I would not react impulsively. I would respond deliberately. After that night, my silence stopped being instinctive. It became strategic. There's a difference between not speaking because you're afraid and not speaking because you're watching. I adjusted my behavior in ways so subtle that no one would notice. I went to bed at my usual time. I kept my routines intact. I even asked him once whether he wanted help cleaning the fireplace, just to observe his reaction. He declined too quickly. I've got it. Of course he did. The gasoline container reappeared once, briefly, in the garage. I pretended not to see it. Instead, I photographed it discreetly when he stepped inside to answer a call. The image wasn't dramatic, just a red plastic canister beside a workbench. But context gives ordinary objects weight. At work, I maintained composure, reviewed compliance reports, flagged suspicious financial transfers for clients I didn't know personally. It struck me one afternoon how ironic it was. I was trained to detect insurance fraud patterns professionally, while privately living inside one that was still forming. But I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an auditor. That mindset saved me from panic. The more I observed, the more predictable his behavior became. He grew oddly attentive, cooking dinner twice in 1 week, asking if I needed anything, even suggesting we spend more time together. It would have been touching if I hadn't already seen the fireplace. Desperation often masquerades as affection. He also began talking about fresh dust. You ever think about moving somewhere new? He asked one evening. Sometimes, I said. He nodded slowly. Sometimes things just reset. Reset. That word lingered the same way Easy had. Silence at this stage was not passivity. It was containment. I didn't accuse him because an accusation forces escalation. And escalation, before you understand the full design, is reckless. Instead, I started making quiet adjustments. I placed a small duffel bag under my bed. Nothing dramatic, just essentials. A copy of my ID, a spare phone charger, cash, the black notebook. I also repositioned a small smoke detector in my hallway that had been malfunctioning. He hadn't noticed it was faulty. I had them months earlier. I replaced the batteries myself. Preparation doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. One evening, he mentioned an electrical issue in the living room. Said the wiring near the fireplace might be outdated. I might call someone to look at it, he said. But he never did, because the wiring wasn't the plan. The plan was something simpler, more controllable. Gasoline doesn't require permits. I found myself studying him differently. Not as a father, as a man under financial pressure, a man whose debts were likely closing in, a man who had increased coverage just weeks earlier. I didn't hate him. That's the part people struggle to understand. Hatred would have simplified this. It would have made my choices easier, my emotions cleaner. Instead, what I felt was a kind of distant sorrow, because somewhere along the line, he had stopped seeing me as irreplaceable. And once someone makes that internal shift, they justify almost anything. He mistook my calm for ignorance. He mistook my silence for trust. He mistook my steadiness for compliance. What he didn't understand was this. When a quiet person stops reacting, it doesn't mean they're surrendering. Sometimes it means they've started planning for survival. I wasn't waiting for him to change his mind. I was waiting to see how far he would go. Preparation is rarely cinematic. It's paperwork, it's timestamps, it's quiet redundancies built into fragile systems. While my father adjusted logs and rehearsed whatever version of tragedy he was constructing in his head, I was building something parallel. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just stable. The first thing I did was verify the insurance carrier's claim protocol independently. Not through him, through public documentation. My professional background made that simple. In cases of residential fire resulting in confirmed fatality, the payout timeline could be accelerated if identification were immediate and uncontested. Dental records, personal effects, household confirmation. Household confirmation, meaning if the only surviving household member verified the identity, processing moved faster. I wrote that down. Then I did something that felt almost detached from emotion. I scheduled a routine dental appointment and requested copies of my most recent x-rays for personal records. Completely legal, completely ordinary. I scanned them, stored them privately. If someone intended to use my absence as proof of death, I wanted my existence to remain verifiable elsewhere. Next, I began tracking my father's financial movements more carefully. Not by hacking, not by invading privacy, but by observing what was already visible. Mail frequency, call patterns, the type of envelopes arriving, short-term lenders, high-interest credit lines, a letter from a private gambling debt recovery agency, the kind that uses polite language but escalating tone. That was confirmation. Desperation had a clock attached to it. He wasn't planning something abstract. He was racing something specific. What he never noticed was how I adjusted my digital footprint. I enabled location sharing with a colleague I trusted, under the pretense of safety features. I began emailing myself nightly summaries of mundane activities. I even posted a time-stamped social media story one evening specifically to establish presence at a certain hour. Not paranoia, documentation. If something happened, narrative would matter. And narrative is shaped by records. I also removed one small but critical variable from his potential plan. Quietly. The night I saw the gasoline, I had noticed something else. The fire extinguisher near the kitchen had expired. He hadn't replaced it. 2 days later, I bought a new one. Same brand, same size, placed it in the same spot. He didn't notice the difference. That detail mattered more than he understood. The fireplace stack remained untouched. The red container appeared and disappeared. And then I found something that shifted my preparation from cautious to urgent. I came home early one afternoon. Again, unexpectedly. The front door was unlocked. That alone wasn't unusual. But in the living room, near the mantel, I saw a framed photograph I hadn't seen before. It was a recent headshot of me, from work, cropped, enlarged, placed beside my mother's memorial candle. No flowers yet, no decorations, just positioned. Testing placement. My breathing slowed, not sped up. He wasn't improvising, he was staging. That night, I moved my duffel bag from under my bed to the back seat of my car. I also parked my car slightly farther down the street than usual. Small adjustments. He never commented. That was the thing about being underestimated. People stop checking whether you've noticed their moves. The final preparation I made wasn't physical, it was psychological. I stopped waiting for proof. Up until then, part of me had still hoped I was wrong. That maybe he was reckless, but not capable of something irreversible. But when you see your own photograph pre-positioned for mourning, hope becomes irrelevant. Clarity replaces it. I didn't hate him. I didn't fantasize about exposing him. I focused on one objective: survive whatever he believed he had designed, and ensure that once it unfolded, the truth would not depend solely on his version of events. What he never noticed was that while he was rehearsing my disappearance, I was preparing for my return. The fire happened on a Thursday night. There are certain details the body never forgets. The way smoke doesn't smell like campfires in movies. It smells chemical, bitter, intentional. I woke up before the alarms. That part still unsettles me. The human body recognizes a threat faster than sound sometimes. My eyes opened into darkness that felt heavier than usual. The air tasted wrong. Then came the crackling. Not loud, controlled. I didn't scream. I didn't call his name. I grabbed my phone, slid out of bed, and opened my door low to the ground. Smoke was already threading down the hallway ceiling. It was moving too fast for an accidental electrical issue. I moved toward the staircase and saw the glow rising from the living room. Orange light bends along the walls. The fireplace. The design had been simple, contained ignition point, accelerant, nighttime, me upstairs. What he had not factored in was the fire extinguisher that hadn't expired. I didn't go downstairs to save furniture. I aimed to create disruption. Enough chaos to force attention. Enough evidence to complicate the narrative. I discharged the extinguisher from the staircase landing toward the source, not to extinguish completely, but to interrupt the pattern. Then I called 911. Not hysterical, not incoherent. Clear address. Report of active fire. 2 occupants in the home. 2 occupants. That phrasing mattered. By the time I reached the front lawn, coughing but upright, neighbors were already emerging. My father came out moments later from the back side of the house, disoriented, performing confusion too heavily. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. That was the private reveal. Not to the police, not to the neighbors. To him, I was standing, alive, not charred, not carried out, not silent under debris. His face changed in microseconds. Shock, calculation, rapid recalibration. He hugged me in front of everyone, held me tightly, too tightly. My God, he kept saying, my God. I didn't pull away. I let the performance unfold. The firefighters controlled the blaze quickly because the extinguisher had slowed it, because the accelerant hadn't fully consumed the structure, because timing hadn't gone according to plan. Inside, the living room was damaged, but not destroyed. The fireplace area was blackened. The mantel is partially scorched. And on the mantel, partially singed but intact, was the framed photograph. My photograph, positioned beside my mother's candle. The fire chief asked standard questions. Where did it start? When did we wake up? Any recent electrical issues? My father began suggesting wiring problems. I didn't contradict him. Not yet. Because clarity isn't loud. Clarity waits. The private reveal continued the next morning. The house smelled of wet ash and chemical foam. Investigators had left. Damage was being assessed. I walked into the living room while he was on the phone in the kitchen. And that's when I saw it fully arranged. The photograph had been recentered on the mantel, cleaned. And beneath it, fresh white flowers, placed overnight. An altar, my funeral photo. Before any official ruling, before any investigation concluded, before even a full day had passed. He was accelerating the narrative. Grief performance requires props. I stood there for a long moment, studying my own face smiling back at me from the frame. I didn't cry. I understood. This had not been a desperate accident. It had been a constructed exit, and my survival had complicated it. That was the moment of full internal confirmation. Not suspicion, not probability. Certainty. He had intended to erase me, not out of rage, out of debt. And now that I was still standing in the same room as my own memorial setup, something settled permanently inside me. I would not confront him emotionally. I would not shout. I would not humiliate him publicly. But I would make one decision that he could never reverse. When someone tries to erase you, the first instinct is to expose them, to call the police, to gather the neighbors, to hold up the framed photograph and demand an explanation in broad daylight. I considered it, not emotionally, such was this dude. Structurally, if I accused him immediately, what would happen? An investigation, yes. Suspicion, possibly charges depending on evidence. But intent is difficult to prove when the fire didn't fully consume the house. Accelerant can be denied, wiring can be blamed, grief can be performed, and without absolute proof, the story could fracture into ambiguity. He would say I was traumatized, overreacting, misinterpreting. The narrative would become murky. I work in compliance. I understand something fundamental. Clarity wins cases, not emotion. So I sat at my desk the morning after I found the altar. The house still smelled like smoke. My lungs still burned slightly when I inhaled too deeply. And I wrote 3 options in my black notebook. Option 1, confront and accuse, immediate conflict, uncertain outcome, emotional volatility. Option 2, leave quietly, cut contact, rebuild alone, clean exit, no accountability. He keeps the narrative. Option 3, document fully, escalate strategically, make it irreversible. I stared at the third option longer than the others. Irreversible doesn't mean destructive. It means final. If I walked away without consequence, he would remain capable of repeating this pattern. Maybe not with me again, but with someone else. Financial desperation doesn't evaporate because a plan fails. It adapts. And I couldn't ignore one detail. The insurance policy still existed. The amendments were still in place. If I stayed silent and simply moved out, he could attempt another version of the story later. different timing, different staging. The risk would remain active, so I chose the irreversible path. Not by screaming, by gathering proof. That afternoon, while he was meeting with a restoration contractor, I accessed the insurance portal using credentials I had always managed. There it was. The accelerated claim form had already been partially drafted. Time-stamped before the fire department had even filed their preliminary report. That was leverage. I downloaded the activity logs, printed them, stored copies externally. Then I requested the official fire incident report through public records. A standard process. I also sent myself the photograph I had taken of the gasoline container weeks earlier, along with metadata. Still, none of that was enough alone. The decisive step came when I scheduled a private consultation with a fraud investigator. Not to accuse, but to inquire. Hypothetical scenario, pattern analysis, documentation review. He didn't overreact. He didn't dramatize. He said one sentence that solidified everything. If someone increased coverage shortly before a suspicious fire and attempted to accelerate a fatality-based claim, that pattern would be flagged. Flagged. That was all I needed. Not outrage, not validation. Confirmation that systems existed beyond his control. I returned home that evening and found him rearranging the mantel again. The flowers were fresher. The photograph is angled more centrally. He looked at me cautiously, as if trying to recalibrate my role in his mind. Was I still easy? Still useful? Still compliant? I smiled softly, asked if he'd eaten. He relaxed, slightly. That was the moment the decision was locked in. I would not fight him in the living room. I would let the systems handle him. And once I activated them, there would be no undoing it. No emotional negotiation, no private forgiveness. Just documentation submitted to the correct channels. Clean, legal, permanent. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. And steadiness, when paired with evidence, is difficult to dismantle. Once you decide on an irreversible action, the hardest part isn't execution. It's a restraint. I didn't submit anything immediately. I refined it, organized it, structured it in a way that removed emotion entirely. Chronology, insurance policy increase, date and amount, amendments to beneficiary structure, notarized copies, gasoline container photograph, time-stamped metadata, drafted accelerated claim form, portal activity log with pre-incident timestamp, fire department preliminary report, ignition origin near fireplace, pending investigation. No adjectives, no accusations, just sequence. I packaged it the way I would prepare an internal compliance escalation at work, because that's what this was, an escalation. Before filing anything, I did one more thing. I secured my independence. I opened a separate bank account at a different institution, quietly redirected my direct deposit, changed mailing preferences to digital-only statements. I also signed a short-term lease on a small apartment across town, month to month. Nothing extravagant. He didn't notice. Why would he? People who believe they control the narrative rarely check for quiet departures. The restoration work on the house began the following week. Contractors moved in and out. Walls were inspected. The fireplace was dismantled partially for safety assessment. The fire marshal returned once for additional questions. My father handled most of the conversation. I answered only what I was asked. Clear, measured, no embellishment. When the marshal asked where I was when the fire started, I described my position at the top of the stairs. When he asked about accelerants, I said I had smelled something unusual before the flames spread. That was enough. Investigations don't require theatrical testimony. They require consistency. Meanwhile, the insurance company assigned a claims adjuster. My father spoke to them repeatedly. I stayed silent publicly, but I monitored the portal activity. There it was again. Attempts to categorize the incident as a total structural compromise. Mentions of fatality confusion. He was trying to frame my survival as misreported information. A chaotic misunderstanding in the smoke. That was when I activated the irreversible step. I submitted the documentation directly to the insurance company's internal fraud division. Not to the general claims desk, to the flagged review channel. Attached, timeline summary, portal logs, photographic evidence, personal statement, neutral, precise, unemotional. Subject line, request for independent review of claim activity prior to fire incident. No mention of him as my father, only as a policyholder. That distinction mattered. I copied the fraud investigator I had consulted, who agreed to act as a third-party observer if needed. Then I waited. Waiting is uncomfortable when you know something significant has been set in motion. But I didn't pace. I didn't confront. I didn't hint. At home, I remained calm, helped coordinate contractor visits, even offered to organize the damaged paperwork. He seemed relieved. Perhaps he believed the narrative had stabilized. Perhaps he assumed shock had softened me. One evening, he said, "We're lucky it wasn't worse." I looked at him and said, "Yes, we are." And I meant it. Because if the fire had gone exactly as he planned, I would not have had the leverage of survival. Silence at this stage wasn't protection. It was positioning. The fraud division acknowledged receipt of my submission 3 days later. They requested additional clarification regarding the predated claim draft. I provided it. Then the calls to him began. Not accusatory, procedural. Requests for explanation. Timeline discrepancies. Policy amendment rationale. I watched his posture change over the next week. Subtle tension in his shoulders. Shorter replies. Increased pacing. He didn't know where the review had originated. He only knew something had shifted beyond his control. And this time, I wasn't the one being repositioned. The first consequence wasn't loud. It arrived in an envelope. Certified mail. He signed for it at the door while I was in the kitchen. I watched through the reflection in the microwave as his expression shifted from casual irritation to something tighter. Insurance companies don't accuse immediately. They inquire, formally. The letter requested clarification regarding policy modifications made within 30 days prior to the incident. It referenced system activity logs and preliminary concerns regarding claim acceleration attempts. I didn't ask what it said. He volunteered an explanation anyway. "Just standard procedure," he said too quickly. "They're being thorough. Over the next week, more communication followed. Phone calls were taken outside. He printed emails and then shredded them. The contractors slowed their work, waiting for the claim approval before proceeding fully. Payments stalled. Assessments were paused pending review. Financial pressure doesn't disappear when a plan fails. It compounds. I could feel it in the house. The air grew heavier, not with smoke this time, but with tension. He began pacing again. Not at 2:17 a.m. this time, but in broad daylight. "What did you tell them?" he asked one evening abruptly. "I answered what I was asked," I said calmly. That wasn't a lie. He studied me carefully, as if trying to detect betrayal in my posture. But I had spent years being composed. My neutrality didn't crack. Consequences rarely feel dramatic at first. They feel administrative. A formal notice of claim suspension pending investigation. A request for financial disclosure. A requirement to provide an explanation for policy changes. Each letter was polite, clinical, but I could see what he saw. The payout was no longer guaranteed. Worse, the narrative was no longer his alone. A week later, 2 investigators requested an in-person meeting. Not the police, insurance fraud specialists. He insisted I sit in. "We're in this together," he said. The phrasing almost made me smile. "Together," I agreed. The meeting was professional. Structured questions, timeline review, digital activity logs are presented on paper. When they referenced the predated accelerated claim draft, his explanation wavered. "I was just preparing," he said, "in case it was worse." "In case of fatality?" one investigator asked evenly. Silence. A pause long enough to be documented. I watched him recalibrate in real time. Adjust tone, soften posture, lean into confusion. But clarity has a weight to it. And once placed on a table, it doesn't evaporate. The meeting ended without accusation, but not without implication. After they left, he didn't yell. He didn't accuse me. He sat down in the living room, in front of the fireplace that had been partially dismantled, and stared at the mantel. The photograph was gone. He had removed it earlier that morning. That, more than anything, told me he understood the direction of this. Over the following days, phone calls increased. Not from friends, not from neighbors, from lenders, from institutions. Pressure compounds quickly when expected funds don't arrive. I watched as the confident performance dissolved into fragmented conversations and late-night muttering. He began avoiding eye contact, not because he knew exactly what I had done, but because he sensed control slipping. Consequences don't need confrontation to be effective. They need structure, and structure was now closing in. Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like overcorrection. 2 weeks after the investigation began, my father tried to reverse everything at once. He contacted the insurance company and withdrew the claim voluntarily. He blamed stress, miscommunication, said the damage wasn't as extensive as initially believed. He requested cancellation of the recent policy amendments, asked to revert coverage to previous levels. But systems don't forget activity logs. Digital timestamps don't dissolve because someone changes their mind. The fraud division responded with something procedural but final. Review would continue, regardless of claim withdrawal. Policy changes within the 30-day window remained subject to investigation. That was the moment I saw true panic. He stopped pacing and started sitting. Long stretches at the dining table with unopened mail in front of him. One evening, he asked, "Did you talk to anyone?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was searching. I answered what I was asked, I repeated. He exhaled slowly. "They're treating me like I did something wrong." I looked at him steadily, then clarify it. The calmness unsettled him more than anger would have. Desperation shifted into negotiation. He began cooking again, offering to start fresh, talking about selling the house voluntarily before things got complicated. But the complication had already begun. A formal notice arrived requesting full financial disclosure connected to outstanding debts, cross-referencing of lender communications, timeline analysis of cash advances leading up to the fire. It was no longer just about property damage. It was about the pattern. You can withdraw a claim. You can cancel a policy. You cannot erase digital behavior that precedes a suspicious event. One afternoon, I returned from work and found him sitting in my room. Not rummaging, just sitting on the edge of my bed, looking at the empty space beneath it, where my duffel bag used to be. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "Because of this." I paused, not to dramatize, but to choose precision. "I'm leaving because I need distance from instability." He flinched at that word. Instability. He stood up slowly. "I would never hurt you." The sentence hung between us, not shouted, not whispered, just stated. I didn't argue, because denial is often most intense when truth is closest. "Then the investigation will reflect that," I said. That was when he understood something irreversible had occurred, not just with the insurance company, with me. The next few days felt like watching someone attempt to outrun a shadow attached to their feet. Calls, emails, attempts to reframe the event as accidental stress-induced misjudgment. But the pattern had already been flagged, and flagged patterns don't quietly disappear. He stopped sleeping. I could hear him awake at night, not stacking wood this time, but shuffling paperwork, trying to reconstruct a version of reality that didn't collapse under documentation. It was too late, not because I had destroyed him, but because he had underestimated one variable. I survived, and survival gave me clarity. The final conversation didn't happen because I demanded it. It happened because there was nothing left to avoid. By then, the insurance investigation had escalated beyond internal review. External auditors were involved. His financial disclosures had revealed debt levels he had never admitted to. High-interest gambling loans, private lenders, repeated cash advances timed almost perfectly with the policy amendments. The house was technically still ours, but it no longer felt like a place either of us belonged in. Half-repaired walls, exposed beams near the fireplace, a mantel stripped of photographs. It was quieter than it had ever been. I had already signed my lease. My bank accounts were separated. My essentials were packed in boxes stacked neatly by the door. He knew I was leaving that day. We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had once sorted utility bills, where I had once believed usefulness equaled love. There was no raised voice, no accusation thrown across wood grain. He spoke first. "They're going to think I tried to..." He stopped, didn't finish the sentence. I waited. "I was under pressure," he continued. "I made adjustments, bad timing, that's all." Bad timing. I folded my hands in front of me. "You increased the policy. You drafted a fatality-based claim before the fire report was filed." He didn't deny it. He just looked tired, older than his years. "I didn't think it would get this far," he said. That sentence held more truth than anything else he had offered. "Not regret, misjudgment. You positioned me in that paperwork," I said calmly. "You rearranged my documents. You placed my photograph on the mantel." His eyes flickered. A brief flash of something. Shame, maybe. "Our calculation is still searching for escape." "That was just shock," he said. I thought you asked if I was a heavy sleeper," I interrupted gently. Not sharp, just precise. Silence filled the room. Confrontation without heat is unsettling. There's no emotional fog to hide behind. He didn't yell, I didn't cry. We were two adults sitting across from the architecture of consequence. "I would have never killed my own daughter," he said finally. I studied his face, and for the first time, I understood something difficult. Intent doesn't always begin with murder. Sometimes it begins with the belief that risk can be controlled, that outcomes can be managed, that fire will behave exactly as planned, that insurance systems are predictable, those daughters are durable. I survived, I said quietly. That's what matters. He exhaled slowly as if the air had weight. They're going to ruin me, he murmured. I stood up, not abruptly, just decisively. No, I said. The investigation will determine what you did. I didn't ruin anything. That was the entire confrontation. No threats, no declarations of hatred, just alignment with reality. As I carried the last box to my car, he remained seated at the table. The house behind me looked ordinary from the outside. Neighbours mowing lawns, mailboxes intact. No visible evidence of what had nearly happened inside. But I understood something clearly as I closed my trunk. Silence had never been weakness. It had been prepared, and now it was distance. I don't tell people this story immediately, not because I'm ashamed, and not because it still controls me, but because it no longer defines me. I live in a small apartment now. 3rd floor, narrow balcony, nothing dramatic. The kind of place that doesn't carry history in its walls. The kind of place where every object inside it was chosen intentionally. For the first few weeks after I left, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. almost every night. My body is still remembering the hour of ignition. Eventually, that stopped. What replaced it wasn't fear. There was clarity about boundaries. The investigation into the insurance claim continued for months. I wasn't required to do much after my initial submission. Documentation speaks when structured correctly. The policy was voided. The claim was denied. Financial scrutiny expanded beyond the fire itself. I didn't attend every meeting. I didn't sit in courtrooms dramatically. I returned to work. I made dinner for one. I watered a small plant I bought for the balcony. Life did not explode into revenge or vindication. It stabilized. That's what people misunderstand about justice sometimes. They expect it to feel triumphant, loud. For me, it felt quiet. The loudest transformation happened internally. I stopped equating usefulness with love. For years, I had believed that being indispensable made me safe. Solving problems secured my place in someone's life. But being indispensable also makes you calculable. Now I ask different questions. Not how can I help? But is this reciprocal? Not how do I maintain stability? But is this stability shared? I still carry the black leather notebook. It sits in my kitchen drawer now, not hidden under a pillow. I still document things, but not from fear, from awareness. And I don't hate my father. That surprises people when they learn fragments of the story. They expect anger to linger like smoke, but hatred would tether me to him. What I feel instead is distance. Distance is clean. I no longer visit the house. I no longer monitor his mail patterns. I no longer check insurance portals. I rebuilt my credit independently, built savings, consulted a financial advisor, not because I was afraid of instability, but because I value autonomy. I also began speaking to a therapist, not to process betrayal alone, but to untangle something deeper. Why had I accepted invisibility for so long? The answer wasn't dramatic, it was simple. I thought being easy made me lovable. Now I understand something different. Quiet does not mean compliant. Calm does not mean unaware. And love that depends on your usefulness is not love. If someone ever tries to erase me again, financially, emotionally, structurally, they will find something different. Not a frightened daughter, not an invisible stabilizer, but a woman who understands systems and understands herself. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a final twist. A courtroom confession, a public apology, a dramatic collapse. There wasn't one. The insurance claim was denied. The investigation concluded with findings that made future coverage difficult for him. Financial consequences followed, slow, procedural, heavy. But there was no cinematic ending, just paperwork. And sometimes paperwork is enough. The real ending wasn't what happened to him. It was what didn't happen to me. I wasn't erased. I wasn't reduced to a framed photograph on a mantle. I wasn't remembered in the past tense while still breathing. I walked out, and that matters more than punishment. There's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't scream. It calculates, it drafts forms, it adjusts policies, it tells you you're easy and hopes you stay that way. If you've ever been the reliable one, the stable one, the one who absorbs pressure without complaint, be careful. Strength without boundaries becomes leverage for someone else. Documentation is not paranoia. Silence is not weakness. And calm does not mean you don't see what's happening. I didn't win by shouting. I won by surviving, by documenting, by choosing an irreversible action that aligned with truth instead of emotion. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as fire. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever mistaken being easy for being safe? And if someone tried to quietly rewrite your existence, would you notice before it was too late? I'm listening.